Well, welcome to the webinar. So this seminar is a little bit of a mashup. I went to speak at the Broad Institute a couple years ago, and the SciComm group there was like, we really want to talk about you know, all kinds of SciComm, and we kind of brainstormed, and we started thinking about all the different things that are necessary in communicating your science when you're going through an interview process. And so that's what this talk is about. And I hope that you get some tips and pointers that will help you, not just with your interview process, but with your career advancement in general. All right, so let's make sure. All right, great. So interviewing is really about communication in general. Let's see. Really, there's no way, even in this remote day and age, to have an interview unless you're talking to people. And whether it's talking on Zoom or talking on the phone or giving a presentation like this, like a webinar, or doing all those things in person, I can only hope in the next few months, you're going to be forced to communicate more and more coherently and, you know, with kind of higher stakes than in many things that you do in your life. So there are a lot of ways you can prepare for this. Scientists spend a lot of time doing technical preparation. That's super important. Learning new science, learning new techniques, learning about the fields that you're working in. But it's really also important to hone these plus skills, and they will benefit you throughout your entire career. So I'm going to talk about three main topics today. Meeting people, which we also call networking. I don't love that term for it because turns people off, but that is how you find job opportunities. The actual interview itself, how to prepare for that, and some kind of out-of-the-box tips for ways to get ready for an interview. And finally, if you get invited to speak, you may want to really hone your speaking skills. In my opinion, any talk that you give is a job talk because you never know who's going to see you in the audience, and people will remember you. I have people come up to me many years later after having seen me speak, and because I was memorable, they remember me, and that is a huge advantage in any career situation. So unless, of course, they remember you because you did something really crazy, but sometimes they remember me for that too. So, okay. So first, let's talk about meeting people. So this is a shorter version, some highlights from my Not Networking 101 seminar, which you can also see on the Addgene YouTube site. People do get opportunities for jobs by meeting other people. I know that there are ads, you know, online. I know that you can go to different job sites. I know that you can use recruiters, but people really like to know the people that they hire. Referrals are a huge part of the job search in this day and age. So this is just a survey. About almost 2,000 scientists were surveyed, or not quite 2,000, about 1,200. How did you get your job? So 52% said networking. 13% said other, that's probably networking too. Really, frankly, recruiters, conferences, events, alumni network, serendipity, the LinkedIn networking website, all those things are networking. Something like 90% of people get their jobs because they know someone. So when you're talking about meeting people randomly in a networking situation, you really want to get an idea of who you're talking to before you jump into who you are. So it's really important to understand who your audience is. If you're speaking to a bunch of first graders, there's one thing that you're going to say. If you're speaking to your relatives who are perhaps not scientists, there's another thing you're going to say. You really want to avoid jargon unless you're really talking to someone who's a specific scientist. So at a networking event, you want to start high. Maybe you want to talk about the weather. What you're looking for is a connection to spark interest and to spark connection. And that may be personal conversation. It may be something that's going on at home and not about your work. In this country in particular, and in many countries, you know, networking is about personal and professional. So you can't just dive into your work. So oftentimes I'm at events with scientists and they want to like immediately tell me, you know, what they're working on today, right? So you first want to start with connecting, not what do you work on, but hey, are you having a good time? What brings you to this event? What brings you to this talk? What brings you to this conference? Your science intro, unless you know you're at a conference about all people who work on tyrosine kinases like I did, you want to start kind of high. I'm interested in how immunity can be regulated. Maybe you want to go deeper. Again, unless you really know your audience, that they know what tyrosine 527 does, you want to start way up high. You know, what are you doing day to day? hey, I use monoclonal antibodies, but not everybody knows what that is. So you might take it up a level, developing detection tools. What are you going to do next? And why are you doing it? Well, everybody in science understands that you have a thesis to write, but maybe you want to take it up a level to be a little bit more interesting and show your engagement in your research. Frankly, you don't even really need to start. If you do meet someone who knows what tyrosine, who works on tyrosine 511 of Sark, you may actually have a lot to talk about, and then you can go into the no column and go very deep. But really, you might just want to say, hey, make it really personal. Do you know anyone with a disease like arthritis or asthma? Well, I'm doing research to try and help understand those diseases a little better and potentially to discover cures. That really takes it to a level where anyone can understand and you can start a conversation. So it's really important when you're in a networking situation to think about your audience and take it to the level where it's really just mutual. And of course, all along this time, you can be asking questions to get to know the other person as well, because that's the way that a conversation starts and relationships are built. So how do you meet cool people who have cool jobs? I mean, most of the jobs, actually, two of the 3 jobs that I have had were never advertised. So the only way that I would know about these jobs was because of people told me about them. And that is true of many jobs in science. They never are publicly advertised. Some of the best jobs are never publicly advertised. So how do you meet people? Well, I find it awkward to be networking, like purposely networking. I'm not one for like speed dating type events or but I do, just like to do things. I like to work with people. I mean, for me, a lot of my network came through the Association for Women in Science work that I did and other volunteer work. So think about getting involved in something beyond just your bench work. Your postdoc association, your grad student association, your special interest group at your company. Have lunch with people that you work with to get to know them better. At a conference, sit down next to someone you don't know. Reach out to people already in your network, people that you're already friendly with to get started, because they're more likely to introduce you to people that you'll enjoy speaking with and that you'll learn something with. The idea is not to network with important people. The idea is to network with people that you like, because you never know where an interesting connection is going to come from. So I really strongly encourage you to network and make it feel normal, which means work with people. You'll get to know each other normally, and then your network will be built from there. People really do like to help. The reason why I have Benjamin Franklin on here is because there's this thing called the Benjamin Franklin effect. He realized that when someone on the Pennsylvania legislature, so Benjamin Franklin is one of the founding fathers of the United States, for those of you not raised on American history. And he wasn't that nice of a guy, to be honest. This is him over here, this little picture. He was kind of, a lot of people didn't like him. He was quite abrupt and sometimes quite rude. And so when someone on the Pennsylvania in the government didn't like him, he would ask them to borrow a book. So they would actually be doing a favor for him. And he noticed that when he borrowed the book, and that's kind of like a bigger deal back then, it's like borrowing someone's computer, perhaps. He noticed that when they did the favor, they liked him better. And this is like an actual science behind this now, is that this is like a cognitive dissonance. We only help people we like, so if I helped you, I must like you. And humans have a natural tendency to kind of want to help people and want to like the people that they help. So there will be a lot of people who will say no in your life. Do not waste your time banging your head trying to get those people to get back to you. Network with the people who are responsive, with whom you are developing a relationship. It doesn't help to keep making yourself crazy. Don't worry about the no people. There will be plenty of yes people who are willing to get to know you and work with you and help you with your career. So it can't wait. This is the main thing about networking. These are just a few tips from, as I mentioned, a much longer webinar. You really have to start now. It is, in fact, never too early to start. The reason for this is that someone who's known you for a while is going to be much more equipped to make recommendations for you and to suggest things that you might do and make connections and understand that there's a position that might be of interest to you, much more than someone who just met you 5 minutes ago. Excuse me. So you don't have to network with people you don't like, but you do have to start developing relationships early and maintain them. Finally, my bottom line rule of networking: if it feels creepy, don't do it. This is the most common question that I get. Someone lays out for me some very creepy scenario where they've contacted some person or stalked them online. And you know, they're like, is that a good idea? I'm like, that is not a good idea. Anything that feels creepy to you, trust your instincts, and don't do that thing. You know, move your network elsewhere if that's what's happening. All right. So again, you can go deeper on this topic. I've just given you a few tips for networking that I hope will be helpful. And I hope that you understand the importance of meeting people in science to further an interesting career. So now let's say you've got the interview. And we at Addgene now, and in all of my jobs before, I've interviewed an enormous number of people and hired quite a few of them. And it is, I'm going to say, frankly, astounding to me the variation in preparation that the scientists in particular bring to the interview. And I don't know, it's something, somehow we think like our scientific training has trained us enough and we don't need to do anything extra. We should just be able to walk in the door. This is just frankly not true. Interviewing is a skill just like anything else. And moreover, when you don't spend time preparing for an interview, it is painfully clear to the interviewer, the person interviewing you and the company interviewing you or the organization interviewing you, that you are ill prepared, which frankly transmits a lack of interest in the actual position. So if you don't care if you get the job, you can do that to practice if you want. But it's really, if you want an opportunity to get a position, you have to show that you put some interest into it. And in fact, you have to actually convince the people that you really want to work there. So you can't walk in the door, and I've had some interviews where we've brought people in and we've said, why do you want to work here? And they can't answer that question. So make sure you can answer that question. That is one of the most important preparation questions that you can do. So you have the internet. It is painfully easy to research an employer. Visit the website, read the press release. LinkedIn is a good place to research a company. You can learn a lot about their culture, what kinds of things they're posting about recruiting. Really, really read the job description. Don't just say, oh, I can do this one thing and then stop reading. You really need to come to the interview prepared to talk about the things that you do that match the description. You do not need to be able to do everything on the description. Job descriptions are aspirational. Most employers would be happy to get half of the criteria on a job description in any good candidate. What's really important is your ability to have addressed those things and understand what are the strengths that you bring to a position. We're going to talk about speaking at the very end, but if you are going to be asked to share a talk, it needs to be an excellent talk. It cannot be a talk that you just slap together. And we'll go through the details of that as the last part of this presentation. So I'm a big proponent of LinkedIn. I like to use LinkedIn a lot. You don't have to go down the rabbit hole, but if you are, especially if you are planning to transition out of an academic career, you must have a LinkedIn profile. It is weird not to have one. I have some blogs on this topic on sort of best practices in LinkedIn. You can look at the Addgene blog and search for that if you want, and there's plenty of online help in how to use LinkedIn. Like I said, you do not have to be a social media aficionado. You don't have to use it all the time, but you should have an excellent profile that looks as good or better than your resume. It is certainly acceptable on LinkedIn to look up the people you'll be interviewing with. If you are lucky enough that the employer has the consideration to give you a list of people who you'll be speaking to, there's nothing wrong with looking them up and seeing more about their career. I love it when people say to me, hey, we're both Penn alums, you know. Making connections with people, this is a great way to do that. Again, be honest about that you looked. It's not creepy and stalking if you're straightforward about it. Also, you may have connections in LinkedIn that can connect you to other people at the organization, and that connection may be a good thing to use as you try and get your resume on someone's desk. I have a blog on that as well, how to write a resume that gets seen with a good cover letter. So there's a lot of research that you can do on LinkedIn. It can be quite useful for career exploration and interview preparation. So one thing about interviewing that I think is underappreciated is that basically, mostly you're going to be talking to strangers. And talking to strangers is truly stressful, even for extroverts. It's a whole day of talking to strangers, sometimes more, and it can be really exhausting. There's a few ways to prepare for these discussions. First of all, I just want to, this talk is really written, you know, kind of before the pandemic crisis. A lot of interviewing is happening online now, video and non-video. One of the things about non-video calls, and in fact, many job screens, the very first thing you will have is a phone call with someone from HR or perhaps the hiring manager before they even bring you in for an interview. And one of the tricky things about that is, and I will apologize in advance, but in general, if you are scientists on this call, this isn't just true about science, but international work, science in particular, our language of choice is English because that is the one that we try to share. I feel very fortunate that English is my native language. If you have a thick accent though, and your native language is not English, it can be very difficult to get past a telephone screen if that is the first part of a job interview for you. So that may mean that you want to do some practice doing that. There are coaches that help people. There are speech coaches. There are ways to improve your English so that you are, the words come quicker to you. I really would hate that to be a disadvantage for you if that was stopping your progression just because it was hard for you to communicate in English. So truth be told, that can be some good preparation you can do. I'm sorry that it is necessary. So another way to practice talking to strangers is to do something called an informational interview. Now, an informational interview cannot happen when you already have an interview lined up or when you have already submitted your resume, because that is unreasonable pressure on the person you are speaking to. Informational interviews are with people that are doing interesting things and you want to understand how they got where they are and ask them questions about their career or their role. They are informal, they can be online, they can be over coffee in the real world, they can be 20 minutes on the phone, but you can learn a lot more about doing informational interviews on my blog on that topic, what is an informational interview. But it's a great way for you to practice talking to strangers about your science, about your career, asking them questions, because asking questions is a great thing in an interview. It helps keep the conversation going and shows your preparedness and your interest. So I really strongly suggest that if you wanted to say, how can I best prepare for interviews coming up? I will do one informational interview a month for the next 4 months. That would be a great goal to set for yourself as a deliverable. Please read the blog for more details, and you can always follow up with me to ask questions. Finally, this is my little really out of the box tip. Interviewing, again, doesn't matter who you are, it's a stressful day. You're not going to remember what you told person number 1 when you're on interview number 4. Your adrenaline is going up and down. You're sweating in between. You're cold when you move to a different room. You're nervous. It's extremely, it can really throw you off the whole day of interviewing, whether it's in person or remotely done. So the way to prepare for something like that is to actually have the things you want to say kind of practiced and thought out already so that you're not thinking of them on the fly. And, you know, interviewing, a lot of it is questions. They're going to say to you, tell me a time when you X. Often it's something tricky, like, tell me a time when you failed miserably. That's a very favorite interview question of people. I don't really know why, but okay. So you want to have some prepared stories ready to answer those questions. And believe it or not, you will forget stuff that happened to you. Like I was once at a meeting, at a networking event actually, and I was talking to this person and we were chatting and he said, hey, you know, we've met before. And I'm like, we have met before. You know, Boston's a small city and everybody knows everybody. He said, no, I think we wrote a paper together. And I'm like, we did? He's like, I think so. So there we are on our phones on ResearchGate, like looking, sure enough, you know, 25 years before we were co-authors on a publication, you know, and we had, you know, you forget stuff, believe me. So it's really great to start early in your career. Keep a Google Doc, keep an Evernote file. I don't care what format you want to use it in, but a running list of stories, half a page, 1 page, that, you know, talks about a successful outcome or something you learned or a skill you gained or something tricky that you navigated. Because if you have interesting stories in your interview is going to be more invigorating for the person you're talking with, and you're going to be much more memorable. And it's going to be much less stressful for you as you navigate the question and answer parts of an interview. So that's just one tip. It was given to me by Sarah Cardozo Duncan, a career coach friend of mine, and I think it's a fantastic idea. Start with 10 stories, start with 5 stories, but then you can add to it throughout your career. You never know when a skill that you had some years ago will become pertinent for a job in the future as well. Okay, so you've gotten to the interview, you're in-house, and you've also been invited to give a talk, and probably that's a science talk for those of you that are scientists. There might be other people on the phone, I don't know. Some careers you're more likely to be asked to speak, some less likely asked to speak in front of a group of people. But anytime you're talking, whether it's at an interview or at a conference or at a meeting, even if it's just a 10-minute blurb, anytime you are speaking in front of a group of people, it is a job talk, because I can't tell you the number of opportunities that have come to me from someone hearing me speak and then later on following up, or me meeting them later. This has affected my career. It's affected my extracurricular activities and volunteer work, many, many things. So public speaking is really something that you should take seriously and something you really need to prepare for. So I'm going to give you a few tips for ways that you can prepare to give great talks. And the first one is watch other people give great talks. So people that give great talks do a few things. They give the audience something to think about so that they're engaged. Maybe it's something the audience wants to argue about. That's good too sometimes, or learn something. And we're not talking about lab meeting here, unless you are like the most prepared person for lab meeting. You know, a presentation of experimental results in order from your notebook is not memorable anywhere except in lab meeting, and probably it's not memorable there either. But the purpose of lab meeting is quite different. We're talking more like keynote presentation. So I recommend that you watch the Young Scientist Seminar series on iBiology if you're looking for science talks, because these are some of the best science talks that you will see. They are engaging, they are well designed, and these speakers do many of the things that great speakers do. And I guarantee you that they all learned how to do that. It wasn't something that necessarily comes naturally. I'm able to speak with some facility and quickly the way that I do because I do it an awful lot. We do not get enough practice publicly speaking. The way to get good is to practice. So start by watching other people. Get some tips from what they do, learn from their level of explanation, how they design their slides, and how the slides complement what they're spoken. This is a great website for learning science anyway, and there's some great career stuff there. So I highly recommend that you watch some talks on iBiology. Every talk that you give should be tailored to the occasion. I give the same topics frequently, but I always review every talk before I give it. I don't reuse a prepared talk unless it perfectly fits. Occasionally it does, but it's pretty rare that everything's exactly the same. First of all, your audience is always slightly different. It's really important to seek out information about your audience so you can pitch your talk the right way, as I started speaking about in the very beginning. Where do you want to start in your explanation, and how in depth do you want to go? Like when I'm speaking about Addgene, I have this one slide that's called "What is a plasmid?" The first thing I have to figure out is, do I need the "What is a plasmid" slide? Sometimes it will be boring for the audience. Sometimes it will be absolutely necessary for the audience. So, you know, that's a thing that you can consider. You know, if you know who you're going to be speaking to, that is helpful. Who's going to be listening? When are they in their career? If someone's hosting you, always ask the host, who's going to be there, and do they have any suggestions on the topic or the depth that you should go in your presentation? An added bonus to knowing your audience, it can help you avoid embarrassing mistakes. So I have made a couple very embarrassing mistakes. One time I made a joke about social scientists in my talk, which really was just a joke, but there were a few social scientists in the audience. Not usually, when I usually speak, they're usually mostly life bench scientists, not always, but often. And I didn't really know who was going to be there, and they were quite offended, and I had to make a lot of apologies. So that was not good. I don't want someone to come to one of my talks and be offended. That is absolutely not my intention. So that's, I think, really important. I've made a couple other really, you know, bonehead mistakes as well in pitching the talk incorrectly. So I learned from my mistakes. Now I'm pretty careful to find out who's going to be in the audience. One time I was at UMass Worcester, and I was speaking to a group of about 200 young faculty and postdocs, excuse me, about work-life negotiation. And a woman in the back of the auditorium raised her hand about halfway through my talk and said, yeah, all this advice is really good, but when should you have a baby? I'm a tenure track professor. And I've been putting it off, you know, for many years because I'm so busy and it's so hard. And, you know, what is the best time to really start your family when you're in an academic tenure track role? And I said, well, do you really want me to answer that in front of all these people? And she said, yes, I really do. I'm sure that everyone is wondering the answer to this question. I said, well, how long have you been married? And she said, I've been married 10 years. And I think she said she was 37. And I said, honey, what are you waiting for? Go home, buy a bottle of wine, light a candle. You are not getting any younger. And it is easier, I'm not saying you should not, but it is easier to do both the biology and the rearing of children if you start a little earlier. Well, the audience completely lost it. I thought it was completely inappropriate. In fact, it wasn't that it was inappropriate. The fact was her husband was also in the room. So I don't think this is a mistake that I could have avoided. Everyone else knew her husband in the room and they were watching his face, and that's why everyone was laughing. So I don't think I could have avoided that one, but I tried pretty hard to know who I'm speaking to avoid that kind of mistake. Okay. So another thing about giving a great talk, I don't think you will forget those two stories that I just told you possibly, because we are biologically programmed to listen and remember better when we hear stories. There's tons of studies on this. So what makes a story? A narrative, it can be short or long, they can be very simple. Something happened next. The listener is thinking what's going to happen, and then there's a solution or an ending. And you know, telling a story like that is something that people are going to remember. A really great talk of science can be the whole talk can be a story of how you came to an important final piece of data, or solved a problem, or created a protocol. You can tell that in a way that's a story, and you can include stories in your talks to be more memorable, more engaging, and to keep the audience much more active. This is a fantastic skill to learn. I have a reference here on the slide, and it talks about why, in fact, stories just mean so much to us as human beings. So these are great things. I have a lot of stories in my head. I'm the daughter of a storyteller, so my dad taught me, now that he's older, he tells the same stories over and over, but we still love them. So if you're not a storyteller, this is something that you can learn, and it's part of writing down those stories and practicing them and making them part of your repertoire. So another tip is to start preparing your talks early, like all the time. You don't want to wait until you need to speak to start creating slides or thinking about content. Maybe you have a Google Slides or a PowerPoint file ready to capture key results from your data, striking images, creative ideas, engaging stories. It doesn't have to be organized. You can do that later. Again, it's just like capturing those stories. You want to start capturing things so your talks really build themselves. So when I am asked to give a talk on a new topic, I usually try and do that at least, you know, about 8 weeks in advance, because during that time, I will be reading things, I will be doing research, I'll be potentially serendipitously hearing something that applies to that talk. And all the time I'm capturing those things into an Evernote folder so that when the time comes to write the talk, it almost writes itself. And so that's where you want to get, because if you wait and write it all at once, you'll miss out on a lot of the ideas you had, and you won't get that sort of lucky images or ideas that you had when you let it take a longer time to prepare. I have many talks that I have, and I go back to them sometimes to get slides and to write a new talk that derives from them. This talk, in fact, is derived from 4 or 5 different sets of slides that kind of put together and modified into a new presentation. So I'm not sure how to say this nicely, but there's nothing worse than a boring talk. I hope that you are not sitting home bored today. So I guess there's no easier way to say this than don't be bored or you'll be boring. So you really need to talk about something that interests you. If you try to present on topics that are not familiar or that aren't interesting, you're not going to be interesting. Scientists like to learn new things, so you want to try not to rehash what's common. And you really want to avoid jargon so you don't lose people. You really want to be stimulating, interesting, tell the story, be as not boring as possible. Really experienced speakers, when they're talking especially about science, present all kinds of tips and useful things that keep the audience engaged. Maybe there's a protocol tip. Maybe there's some geeky science detail about the time they blew up some piece of equipment. What was the aha moment? We love the aha moment as scientists. Everyone loves that. Again, this is really general. And what's going to happen in the future? Really knowing your topic, being interested and excited about it. You don't have to speak like me. You can speak like you. But if you don't have any excitement, your audience will know. So please don't try and choose a topic that is, boring to you. I mentioned already how important it is to practice. If I'm in a live audience, I will ask people now to raise their hands. When was the last time you gave a 45-minute talk about your science that wasn't lab meeting? I do this, I'm giving talks like this even via webinar 1 to 2 times a week. I get a lot of practice. I've given hundreds of presentations. You don't get better at speaking unless you speak in front of a real audience. You cannot expect to do this well the first time if it's the very first time. So I really recommend that you find sympathetic friends. Maybe you form a peer mentoring group to practice giving talks to each other and getting feedback, honest feedback. Wouldn't you rather hear it from them than a less supportive audience, or when you're actually in the interview? So there's nothing better than having real people listen to you and give you feedback on your speaking. So I really recommend that you find ways to practice, and the more that you practice, the easier and better it gets. So let's talk a little bit about slides. So I found this slide share on LinkedIn that if you want to search for it and find it, it's a really excellent deck on giving successful presentations. So the very first rule of slides: more is not better. Do not smash on a lot of information. I cannot tell you how many science talks I have seen where it's just slide, data, 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 things unlabeled well, piled on images. Maybe it's animated, image, 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 image. That is absolutely tedious. You have no story. More is not better. Pick what you want to say. Tell a good story. Every bit of data does not need to be shared. Do not ever have anything on your slide that makes you have to say, oh, there's a lot on the slide, but I'll just tell you about it. This is my huge pet peeve. Your images should be large. Your fonts should be no smaller than probably 18 point, depending on the size of the room. Don't pass up opportunities to show cool visuals, but don't overdo the effects. If you can use video and you're confident, it's great these days to include video snippets, video information. I'm not always confident that it's going to work when I'm traveling. But it does keep people engaged. But I go back to the first line: more is not better. Your data are not more convincing because you show me 30 pieces of data that say the same thing. You have to figure out ways to summarize and to make it a story that goes at a good pace with the correct size images and the correct size text to tell a good story. The other thing that good speakers do is they know the questions people will ask. So one reason why you don't have to tell your whole story in your talk is it actually gives people good things to ask questions about. And you are ready for them. So it's always good to have a few extra slides ready to answer questions. That shows a really good facility with public speaking. When you're practicing a talk, encourage your listeners to ask questions and write those down, because their questions are the kinds of ones that you want to be prepared to answer. If they ask, someone else might ask. Don't ever make up an answer. If you don't know, just say you don't know and you'll get back to them. It's a great networking opportunity to say to that person, I'd like your card. I'm really interested in your question and I want to get back to you about it. And finally, at panel discussions and at presentations, one thing I like to do is to have an ally in the audience. If there's a question that I think someone should ask, I make sure that they know that question, and that gets the questioning off to a good start, especially for an audience that might not be comfortable asking questions. So, there's nothing wrong with doing that, and it can really help get a good audience discussion going in some situations. I'm going to say it again. Resist the urge to say everything. More is not better. You should never have more than one slide for every 1.5 minutes of talk length, and that is generous. Get there and then cut a few more slides. Do not run over your time. No one wants to hear you speaking longer. It just makes you seem unprepared or arrogant and frankly inconsiderate of the people in the audience. When I was working at Abbott, there was this one person who always went over. always. It got to the point where if 2 or 3 speakers were going to be speaking at an event, you would make sure that you went before him, because if you went after him, you would never get a chance to speak. If he was given 3 slides, he prepared 30. It was unbearable. It was inconsiderate. And I never understood why the senior people at the organization didn't do anything about it until the very head of the company. We had a new CEO at the company, or I think maybe it was a new head of research. And he came to hear about all of the projects at our site. And there were going to be 35-minute presentations throughout the day. It was going to be a long day. And everyone had 5 minutes to present their slides, 3 slides to present your talk, to present your project. And I was honored that I got to do that, because it was kind of a big deal to get in front of this guy. And we all had 5 minutes, 3 slides. That was what we did. So this guy got up, he had 3 slides, but there was so much animation. It was the equivalent of, like, I don't even know how many slides. It was ridiculous. And he got to his first slide and he started piling on the images as they animated in, and his 5 minutes was up and he wasn't even really done with the first slide. And the head of research said, okay, you're done. And the guy said, but, and he said, no, you're done. Your time is up. And he said, he said, no, you need to sit down. And he got up out of his chair and pulled him off of the stage. You never saw so many scientists wanting to stand up and cheer in a room in your life. So don't be so pompous to think that your information is more important. You need to learn how to condense and say what you need to say in the required amount of time. Resist this urge to say all your data. I cannot say this enough. More is almost never better. The best speakers speak without notes. I know that this is hard. It may not be where you start, but it is a good goal to have in mind, because people listen better. When you're reading something, it is much harder. For people to listen, it's much more, even people that read books out loud are very engaging. They use different voices. It's very hard to speak from notes in an engaging way. So, excuse me. So try to speak without notes. If you're prepared enough, you should be able to move there. Don't be hard on yourself if you stumble and make a mistake. As you can hear, I make mistakes all the time. I say way too much. It's really nice, these subtitles. This is an accessible talk. I've turned on the closed captioning on this presentation. It cuts out all the ums, which I love. It makes me sound much better than I am. The audience doesn't really care about these verbal tics. Actually, that's why robots sound like robots, because they don't make mistakes and they don't stumble over their words. So we as humans don't mind so much about that. Don't be hard on yourself. It's fine. The best speakers engage the audience. So if you can get to the point where you're comfortable doing this, maybe you want to take an informal poll. I've been using some breakout rooms in some of my presentations to engage people. Hopefully you'll have some questions in the chat, which I will address when we get to the end. I love that. I love to have the audience engaged. I love to have the audience interrupting me. Sometimes I do, I ask people in the audience to stand up and speak. Sometimes I ask the audience if they have advice. A little bit hard on a webinar, but because there are often experts in the room that can add value to your presentation and you can learn from. The best speakers are enthusiastic. Once again, if you're boring, people will be bored. So even if you are quiet, you need to find a little excitement and enthusiasm and at least interest in your own topic. Again, you don't have to emote beyond your comfort zone, but if you aren't excited, why should the audience be excited? Finally, the best speakers have experience. Back again to practice, practice, practice. That's how you get good at speaking. Don't be fooled that speakers don't have to work at it. You have to put in some effort to really make this work for you. Okay, so that's all of my slides for today. I'm going to go to the chat to look for some questions. And you can see all the content that I talked about is on the Addgene blog or on the Addgene YouTube site. You can reach out to me directly if you like by some of these social media streams, and I'm happy to help you. I am at @Kamens on Twitter. Okay, so I'm going to the questions now. Let's see. Okay, tips for networking for introverts. So please watch my Not Networking 101. Introverts really introverts, extroverts. I'm married to an introvert. He does just fine in his career. He's you know, very, very successful manager of many people. Being introverted just means you're a good listener. You can actually be a better networker. Networking is not about talking. It's often about asking good questions and listening. So you may not want to go to events, but you might want to do more informational interviews, those one-on-one conversations, or get active in volunteer work. So that might be the slight change for you. If events really freak you out, then don't go to events. That's not the way that you want to network. If you look in the chat, Addgene Angela, who is online, Angela Bitua, has posted some of the links to the content that I have been talking about in the chat. Okay, Margarita Rosa says, sometimes I try to be more active and funny during talks, but I think that my bosses do not enjoy that. What do I do? Oh my goodness. When I was 6 months pregnant, I had been working at Abbott for about a year and a half, maybe almost 2 years. I'm not quite sure, about 2 years. And it was my turn to give the all company presentation about my science. And I felt incredibly I was very I felt embarrassed, like I was just huge. I just felt very huge and weird to be standing up in front of talking to people. So I actually, to get rid of my embarrassment, I scattered little images of like babies and baby bottles through my slides, like in the corners. And I gave this very sciencey talk about my work, which was quite serious. And then you know, that way I was sort of like, hey, this is the elephant in the room. I am giant and pregnant. I just want to get past that, you know, forget about it. So it's sort of my way of being funny. Well, my boss called me into his office and he's like, would you ever give a talk like that outside the company? It was like not really appropriate. I was like, I would never give a talk like that outside the company. That was just a like internal family kind of talk, you know. You know, I think a lot of people are really going to stay awake better if you have a little humor and engagement and energy in your talks. As long as the content that you cover is excellent and your slides are excellent, I think you can bring your own personality. Who wants a boring talk? So I'm sorry if your boss doesn't enjoy that. Make sure you're covering the key information and not wasting people's time. But if you're engaged and the humor and the excitement is about the topic that you're speaking about, I certainly think it's appropriate. Okay, let's see. Let's see. Okay, one of the biggest problems I'm running into lately is that I do not have industry experience. How do I overcome this? You need to meet people from industry, because referrals are a big part of getting jobs in industry. So I don't think you need to have industry experience. I think that you need to know people who understand who you are and are interested in working with you. So please watch the Not Networking webinar. It has a lot more on how to break out of that. I don't yet have industry experience. I also have a seminar on transitioning out of academia, and you might find that interesting. Okay, I think that's all the questions. I don't see any new ones. I think I got them all. Feel free, as I said, to reach out and follow us on social media. Thanks for coming today, and take care, everybody.